Welcome back. All right, I want to take a look at the Eastern playoff race. A little bit of a different video today looking at this because I do think that we're due for at least some kind of massive upset in the first round, either in the East or in the West. So I wanted to take a look at it from the Eastern perspective because it feels like, and I'm saying it feels like because things can be quite different when the playoffs start, it feels like the teams in the East that are fighting for that final playoff spot or spots are a little more dangerous than the teams in the West. And I'm not saying that that necessarily is going to be the case in a month because the playoffs are very unpredictable. That being said, right now, the number one wild card, and I put them on this side of the board because I don't think Ottawa's in any danger right now. 64 games, 73 points. They're 4 points clear of the playoff line. It doesn't sound like a lot, but at this time of the season, it can be. Especially since they seem to be playing better. And what I've done here is I've gone through the most recent lines these teams have used. So, top line, top two defensemen, and I've written in the top goaltender, which should be pretty self-explanatory. But for Ottawa, their top line of Tkachuk, Stützle, and Giroux, that's an excellent top line. And I think Ottawa's going to be dangerous come playoff time. Sanderson and Zub as the top pairing on the blue line, and of course, Ullmark in net. Ullmark's playoff track record? Iffy. And I say that as a Boston fan that really wanted to see Ullmark break through or Swayman break through. And so Ullmark's going to have to put the team on his back, I would think, if they're going to get an upset in that first round, since they're going to have to play against probably a pretty darn good team. Now, recently, 2017, if we count that recently, the last time this team was in the playoffs in 2017, they were one game away from the Stanley Cup final. And even though they were second in the division, people do count that as a Cinderella run. I don't necessarily see it as a Cinderella run. I've talked about that before. But I get it. I get it because Ottawa gets overlooked. Ottawa's not a team that people look at and say, now that's a team that I really don't want to play. But I do think there are going to be some teams that may not want to play them in the first round. Now, if the playoffs started today to be Ottawa against Florida, I think everybody would want to see that. And you'd really hope that Matthew Tkachuk's 100% for the start of that series, because then we get a battle between the Tkachuk brothers in the playoffs. Yeah, the storylines would be fantastic coming out of that. Now, moving over to this side of the board, and we'll go down this whole side here. Columbus, currently the number 2 wild card, 70 points in 64 games. Their top line, Voronkov, Fantilli, and Marchenko, one of the more underrated top lines in the NHL. And I say that because Columbus just doesn't get a lot of attention. This is a team that they did score that huge upset in the first round against Tampa Bay in 2019, which broke everybody's brackets. But since then, it's been a little bit more of a challenge for them to get back to that kind of a height. Of course, in 2020, they knocked out Toronto in the play-in round, but then they lost in the first round in a matchup against the Tampa Bay Lightning. So their top defensive pairing, Werenski and Fabro. Dante Fabro has been a revelation for Columbus. And Don Waddell has shown numerous times this season that either he has a really good eye for the right player to pick up, or they have some excellent professional scouts in the Columbus organization that knows exactly who's going to work for them. Now, their starting goaltender being Merzlikins, Elvis has had a very up and down season. I don't know if Elvis is a goaltender that leads a team on a Cinderella run in the playoffs, but stranger things have happened. So they may look back on 2019 and say, hey, we can do this again as a wild card team. And especially if they're against a juggernaut like Washington, and we'll talk about Washington when we get there. But Columbus is not unfamiliar with Washington, so it could be quite the first series matchup if that's what we end up seeing. And then Montreal, just below the playoff line. They played 65 games, so Columbus has played one less. 69 points. And the top line for Montreal, this is an excellent top line by any standard. And it's funny because it's not that long ago, at least doesn't feel like that long ago, that I talked about Suzuki's two-way play and compared him to some elite players, and there was some pushback. Suzuki's not that elite, but he's become that. So, top line of Caulfield, Suzuki, and Slafkovsky. Slafkovsky's also having the kind of second half he did last year. He's just waited a little bit longer, building dramatic tension, I get it. And then your top defense, Matheson and Carrier. So, that's another former Nashville defenseman that's on a top pairing recently. And it does kind of make you wonder what exactly has gone on in Nashville that these players go elsewhere and have a lot of success. So there's definitely a conversation to be had there. Montembeault, the top goaltender, of course, from Montreal. Dobesh got off to a really good run initially. But yeah, Montembeault's the starting goaltender there. Of course, 2010 was the Halak run, 15 years ago. And if they get in against the Washington Capitals in round one, if that's our round one matchup, we will hear a lot of discussion about that. And not just from me. So 2021, they went all the way to the Stanley Cup final. That was definitely a Cinderella run. No one expected that. They won less than half of their games during that season. In the Canadian division, where a lot of people felt like, okay, the NHL just wants Toronto to win a division and go all the way to the conference final, which was the semifinals that year. But it didn't happen. Montreal said no, and they came back from 3-1 down and went all the way to the final that way. Then you got the Rangers, 65 games, 68 points. I'm going to say it again. I think the Rangers could be a very dangerous team come playoff time. That while you can look at Montreal and say, well, Montembeault doesn't really have a playoff resume to go with, and Elvis Merzlikins, a bit shaky. Even get up here to Ottawa and Ullmark, his career numbers in the playoffs, not fantastic. Shesterkin's pretty darn good come playoff time. So if the Rangers get in, they might be a nightmare scenario for whoever they play against because there won't be a lot of pressure, and this team can hurt you. Their top line currently, Panarin, Trocheck, and Cooley, and I will not tolerate Cooley disrespect. Will Cooley is an excellent forward, and all kidding aside, I honestly, I think the Rangers, while they've had their stumbles here and there, I still think they're dangerous. On the blue line, you got Keandre Miller and Borgen. One thing with Fox getting injured, it does show how much they've changed their blue line. So when I'm looking at the depth chart, I was like, wow, the New York Rangers have completely revamped their blue line this season, and I don't know that we're talking about it. And I think we should be, so maybe at some point I need to do a video on the New York Rangers and discuss that. But yeah, Shesterkin in net, we know what Igor can do. And then their backup is Jonathan Quick, who has a bit of a playoff reputation. Has been pretty good in the playoffs before. Yes, that was a while ago, but we saw Marty Brodeur towards the end of his career go on a nice long run with New Jersey, so you just never know. In the 2014 season, the Rangers go all the way to the final. I don't know if that qualifies as a Cinderella run, maybe a little bit, but the New York Rangers, I still think, of the teams on this side of the board, might be the most dangerous should they get to the playoffs because you've got Igor, you've got some very good forwards, and if the defense holds up, you never know. Detroit, 65 games for them as well, 68 points. Their top line, and this is, of course, most recently, Soderblom, Larkin, and Raymond. Soderblom is huge, and if he really, truly clicks, and he seems to be starting to at the NHL level, look out. On the blue line, you got Sherratt and Seider. I would imagine that people have an opinion about Sherratt being paired with Seider. They have in the past. The one thing that works against Detroit, there's a couple things. First off, they last made the playoffs in 2016, so they don't have a ton of experience with a lot of their core players. Patrick Kane's got enough for everybody, though. But then who's their starting goaltender going to be? If this team made the playoffs tomorrow, is Talbot the starter? Talbot's numbers have dropped off. Mrazek won that game last night, so is Mrazek in the running? And then there's Alex Lyon. Lyon's numbers the last couple games he's played haven't been awful, so who's the starting goaltender for Detroit? And generally the team that you're looking at the start of the playoffs and you say, I don't know which guy's the starter, usually doesn't go that far in the playoffs. Although, if you go back far enough, to 2010 specifically, the Philadelphia Flyers kind of had a committee of goaltenders and still went all the way to the final. Boston, 66 games, 68 points. I'm going to keep saying Boston's not in the running. I'm going to keep saying Boston's not in the hunt. It's been interesting to watch them since the deadline, though. Just 2 games, but tonight I will be watching them closely because they just seem to be playing better. Geeky, Zacha, and Pastrnak being the top line. I wouldn't have thought that line would be overly productive, but the last couple games, it's been good. On the blue line, Zadorov and Yoki Haru. It definitely is an issue that they don't have McAvoy and they don't have Lindholm. It's part of the reason why I still don't see them as really a threat to take that spot from Columbus and jump past these teams or to get anywhere near Ottawa. But could they? And if they get to the playoffs, could McAvoy or Lindholm make a return? That kind of thing, right? Not saying they do, just throwing that out there. This is a team that if they get to the playoffs and get a little bit healthier, they could make things difficult. Jeremy Swayman, he's up and down from one day to the next, and I think his numbers in the second half have been better than the first half. I haven't looked at him in a while. It's right up there with looking directly at the sun. I just don't generally look at Swayman's numbers from game to game that much, but it does feel like he's been playing better lately. The last time that the Bruins missed the playoffs was 2016, and so maybe it's time. Because the last time Detroit made the playoffs was 2016, so maybe if Detroit gets in and Boston misses, maybe that's the hockey gods just, switching things up a little bit. But this is going to be a really interesting finish because Boston doesn't have any pressure now. They sold off Marchand. There's really no reason to think there's any drama going on with the Boston Bruins at this point. So with that pressure being off, could they be the most dangerous team on the board to Columbus? And if they make the playoffs as an underdog, would Boston be a team to keep an eye on? I went looking back through the entire time I've watched them as the Bruins since 1981, and I couldn't find a real underdog run that they had. Usually, if they go on a run in the playoffs, they're at least first or second in the division. So there you go. But I wanted to talk about the top teams too, because if these teams are going to knock anybody off, it has to be one of these teams that goes out in the first round, or else they're all we're going to be talking about is how the wild cards just couldn't get it done. Now, Washington, they have 94 points in 65 games, so they are 11 points clear of Florida for tops in the East. They have it locked down. The last time they won a round was 2018. The last time they won a round was the last time they won the Stanley Cup, which was also the first time they won the Stanley Cup. Now, they've won the division 13 times in their history, and that is various divisions under different names, right? Going all the way back to the Patrick division in the 80s. But in the 13 times they've won the division, they've lost in the first round 8 times, by my count. They've lost in the second round 4 times, but that 13th time, they won the Stanley Cup. So if you're a Caps fan, you can say, don't care about the other 12. They did win that Stanley Cup that 13th time. So guess what? Here comes Cup number 2. But if you want to talk about, hey, the Caps do struggle when they win the division, historically, it's right there. 8 times out of 13 that they win the division, they go out in the first round, including back in 2010 against the Montreal Canadiens, who, it was a shocker. It's why we still talk about it 15 years later. Ended up going on a little bit of a run there before meeting Philadelphia, did the Montreal Canadiens, and then Philadelphia knocked them out. The Canes, 65 games, 82 points. Their 82 points puts them right directly between Florida and Toronto, so I do feel like these are the top 4 teams by the record. I didn't put Tampa on the board because Tampa is behind Toronto, and I felt like I'll do the dividing line there. But Carolina is an interesting one. Carolina needs to show what they can do in the conference final. They have been swept in the conference final in 2009, 2019, and 2023. So it is a very interesting picture that's been painted by this Carolina organization, where come playoff time, yeah, they're pretty good, but they are still looking at one Stanley Cup in their history back in 2006. They have a very good lineup. They have a deep lineup, but are they maybe vulnerable to an early exit? Maybe. But it looks like at this point they're going to play against New Jersey, unless Columbus or the Rangers end up going on a run between now and the end of the season and get themselves into a series against the Carolina Hurricanes. Florida is leading the Atlantic going into tonight's action against Toronto. So Toronto looking to win and get ahead of Florida via having a game in hand. Florida, 65 games, 83 points. Of course, they were finalists in 2023. They won the Stanley Cup in 2024. So could they be upset in the first round? It does happen. Most recently, a defending Stanley Cup champion in the Colorado Avalanche got upset in the first round by the Seattle Kraken when trying to defend their Stanley Cup championship. So it does happen. We never anticipate when it's going to happen. No, almost nobody called Seattle knocking out Colorado in the first round in 2023. So could Florida end up falling and losing in the first round? It is possible. If you get Florida and Ottawa, yeah, that series could be fantastic. I'd be very happy to be, watching Florida-Ottawa games and telling you guys what happened, because I think they'd be violent games, but they'd also be exciting games. And I'm a big fan of 2 teams that play kind of an exciting style playing against one another, which is one thing I would worry about, say, for instance, if the Caps met Boston in the first round. That might be kind of a slow first round. That could see a lot of 2-1 scores if that was the case. Because I think Boston would force Washington into that defensive shell, which Washington's fine with. Washington can play various styles of game and still win. So, yeah, that's what could happen there. Then you got Toronto, 64 games, 81 points. I didn't put anything down for a run or anything. And honestly, we all know the story with Toronto. We talk about Toronto often. Both I talk about it here on the channel and off the channel. Toronto comes up a lot. And there's always the discussion about how they haven't won a Stanley Cup since 1967. And so let's just say Toronto wins the division. My guess is that going into the first round, if you had Toronto against, say, Ottawa, people are going to pick Ottawa. I really think that if there's a first round series, that the vote would go towards Ottawa knocking out Toronto in the first round. Now, historically, Toronto does very well against Ottawa in the playoffs, but that history is over 20 years ago. So, can Ottawa, channel that energy from the teams from 20 years ago? Do they call in guys from those teams and find a way to fight back and not get knocked out by Toronto? Or does Toronto bring in guys from 20 years ago to say, all right, so here's how you take out Ottawa? One thing with the Ottawa series against Toronto, you could see when Toronto had them and Ottawa was just done. And I remember talking to guys at work, and the series was still going on, and saying, wow, so Ottawa's done, huh? They can't fight back against Toronto. Oh, this is kind of an iffy series, and it was just weird. And it's not dissimilar to what I talk about with Toronto, where I think a lot of their struggles are psychological as much as anything else. Where as soon as a puck goes in their net and it's a key moment of the game, everybody tightens up, everybody tenses up, and you can kind of see this body language from them, like, here we go again. So let me know your thoughts. Which team do you think on this side of the board would be most successful as a wild card, maybe knocking off a top team? And if you are a wild card team in the East, whether it's the first wild card or second wild card, which team would you not want in the first round of these four teams? And which team would you want in the first round? And maybe give me a reason why as well. I think that could be a fun discussion. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe in the event that you may not have done so already. I absolutely love that there are so many teams that are still in the hunt for that final playoff spot. It is so much more interesting to see a season that's like this than a season a few years ago where the top 8 teams in the East were way ahead of the bottom 8 teams in the East, and it was just a matter of who was going to play against who. This season's a little more exciting than that. But let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't already done so. Thank you guys so much for all your support as always. I will talk to you again soon.